The story of chewing gum in the Soviet Union is not merely a tale of confectionery or consumer goods. It is a window into the mechanics of ideological control, the psychology of prohibition, and the unintended consequences of state paternalism. What appears at first glance to be a trivial matter of candy reveals the profound tensions between a closed society and the gravitational pull of global culture, between the aspirations of youth and the anxieties of aging revolutionaries who saw threats in the smallest gestures of Western life. To understand why a simple strip of flavored rubber became a flashpoint in Soviet society requires examining the architecture of Soviet ideology, the evolution of the Cold War, and the tragic human costs that sometimes resulted from the collision between desire and doctrine. Chewing gum was never formally banned in the Soviet Union. No decree from the Politburo explicitly outlawed its possession or consumption. No article in the criminal code prescribed punishment for chewing it in public. Yet, this absence of official prohibition masked a deeper, more pervasive form of control. The Soviet system operated not only through laws, but through an elaborate network of social pressure, ideological conditioning, and unspoken rules that governed behavior far more effectively than any statute. Chewing gum fell into this gray zone of the unofficial but condemned, the legal but frowned upon, the available but dangerous. It became what Soviet citizens learned to recognize as something that did not fit the Soviet notion of what was right, a phrase that encompassed everything from jazz music to blue jeans, from abstract art to the simple act of chewing while walking down the street. The ideological opposition to chewing gum was rooted in the broader Soviet critique of American culture and capitalism itself. Soviet ideologists, tasked with maintaining the philosophical purity of the socialist experiment, condemned chewing gum as a symbol of the meaninglessness of the capitalist system. The reasoning followed a particular logic that made sense within the Marxist-Leninist framework. Capitalism, in this view, produced not to satisfy genuine human needs, but to generate profit through artificial demand. Chewing gum represented the epitome of this wastefulness, a product with no nutritional value, no practical function, nothing but the mindless repetition of jaw movement. It was consumption for consumption's sake, the perfect metaphor for a system that valued exchange over use, appearance over substance. Moreover, it was distinctly American, and by the 1950s and 60s, American culture had become the primary ideological adversary, more threatening in some ways than American military might because it operated through attraction rather than coercion. Until the 1970s, the Soviet Union did not produce chewing gum domestically. This absence was not accidental, but reflected both the economic priorities of a command economy and the cultural gatekeeping exercised by the state. In a system where production was planned according to ideological and strategic considerations rather than consumer demand, frivolous Western products had no place in the manufacturing schedule. The few Soviet citizens who knew about chewing gum and had actually tried it belonged to a narrow elite: diplomatic staff and their families, members of the nomenklatura who traveled abroad on official business, translators who worked with foreign delegations, and a handful of others whose positions granted them access to the world beyond Soviet borders. For the average Soviet citizen, chewing gum remained unknown, a product that existed only in rumor and imagination, if it existed in their consciousness at all. The death of Joseph Stalin in 1953 marked a turning point in Soviet society. The subsequent period, often characterized as the thaw under Nikita Khrushchev, saw a gradual and carefully controlled loosening of the total isolation that had defined the Stalinist years. The Iron Curtain, while still firmly in place, developed small perforations through which elements of Western culture began to seep. In 1955, Soviet citizens gained the theoretical right to travel abroad, a development that would have been unthinkable just years earlier. But this right was hedged with so many restrictions and conditions that it remained a privilege of the very few, rather than a freedom of the many. Those who wished to travel faced an exhaustive vetting process designed to ensure absolute loyalty and minimize the risk of defection. Applicants required an impeccable reputation, multiple recommendations from party officials and workplace supervisors, and had to complete a 5-page questionnaire detailing every aspect of their personal history. They even needed a medical certificate confirming their fitness for foreign travel, a requirement that proved difficult to obtain even for the perfectly healthy. Art historian Mikhail Herman later recalled the absurdity of this medical requirement, describing how he obtained his certificate through payola, a form of bribe or favor. Even healthy individuals found doctors reluctant to issue the necessary paperwork. Herman noted that one could be fit for military service, yet somehow deemed unfit for a trip abroad, a contradiction that revealed the political rather than medical nature of the requirement. The Soviet state wanted to ensure that only the most reliable citizens encountered the capitalist world, those whose ideological conditioning was strong enough to withstand the temptations and propaganda they would encounter beyond Soviet borders. Even when approved for foreign travel, Soviet citizens faced severe financial restrictions. They could take only a limited amount of money with them and exchange it for foreign currency, amounts so small that every purchase required careful calculation. Travelers prioritized significant items like clothing or electronic equipment, goods that were scarce or inferior in quality back home. Small items like chewing gum rarely made the list of priorities. As a result, chewing gum did not enter the Soviet Union in large quantities through official tourist channels. The real influx would come through different routes, through events that brought foreigners into Soviet territory rather than sending Soviets abroad. The first major wave of chewing gum popularity in the Soviet Union likely coincided with the Sixth World Festival of Youth and Students, held in Moscow in 1957. This massive international gathering brought thousands of foreign visitors to the Soviet capital, young people from around the world who carried with them the material culture of their home countries. For many Soviet youth, the festival represented their first direct encounter with Westerners, and these encounters often involved exchanges of small gifts and souvenirs. Foreign visitors gave chewing gum, among other items, and received Soviet trinkets in return, particularly the colorful badges and pins that Soviet citizens collected. These exchanges began as friendly gestures, expressions of international solidarity and youthful curiosity. But the line between gift-giving and commerce proved thin and easily crossed. When these friendly exchanges evolved into commercial transactions, they entered the realm of fartsovka, the underground trade in foreign goods that operated in the shadows of Soviet legality. Fartsovka occupied a dangerous space in Soviet society. Those who engaged in it, known as fartsovshchiki, faced potential arrest for speculation or illegal foreign currency transactions, charges that could result in prison sentences. The Soviet Criminal Code treated private commerce as a form of parasitism, an exploitation of the socialist system for personal gain. Yet the risks did not deter Soviet youth, for whom Western goods represented not just material objects, but symbols of a wider world, tokens of a lifestyle that seemed more colorful and free than the gray regimentation of Soviet daily life. The World Festival of Youth and Students thus served as a catalyst, introducing chewing gum to a generation of young Soviets who would seek it out for years to come, transforming it from an unknown curiosity into a coveted commodity. The next major surge in chewing gum's presence in Soviet society came with the 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow. The atmosphere surrounding these games was tense and politically charged. In response to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in December 1979, the United States and dozens of other Western nations boycotted the Moscow Olympics, turning what should have been a showcase of Soviet achievement into a reminder of international isolation. Soviet authorities, already paranoid about Western interference, became obsessed with security and the possibility of sabotage. Moscow was effectively closed to free entry, with checkpoints controlling access to the capital. Children were encouraged to leave the city for the summer, officially because it was vacation time, but also to reduce potential complications during the games. Those residents who remained in Moscow received repeated warnings to maintain vigilance and avoid contact with foreigners. It was in this atmosphere of heightened suspicion that one of the most bizarre propaganda campaigns in Soviet history emerged. Rumors began circulating through Moscow and other cities, hosting Olympic events that foreign chewing gum posed a physical danger to Soviet citizens. The exact origin of these rumors remains difficult to establish with certainty, but their content was remarkably consistent and specific. According to these stories, police officers were visiting schools and factories to warn that chewing gum given by foreigners might be poisoned, or, even more grotesquely, might contain hidden razor blades designed to cut the mouths of unsuspecting Soviet children. Some versions of the rumor cited a specific case of a schoolboy who had accepted such a gift and ended up hospitalized with severe injuries. The warnings extended beyond physical danger to ideological contamination. Accepting gifts from foreigners was characterized as worshipping the West, and those who did so were supposedly just a few steps away from being recruited by foreign intelligence services. These rumors, whether spontaneously generated by popular anxiety or deliberately planted by security services, reflected the paranoid logic of a system that saw every interaction with the outside world as a potential threat. The idea that Western intelligence agencies would distribute poisoned or blade-filled chewing gum to Soviet children as part of some elaborate sabotage operation was objectively absurd. Yet it found purchase in a society conditioned to view the West as implacably hostile and infinitely devious. The rumors also served a practical purpose for the authorities, discouraging contact between Soviet citizens and foreign visitors during a period when such contact was unavoidable, given the presence of thousands of Olympic athletes, coaches, journalists, and the limited number of tourists from non-boycotting nations. Yet for all the warnings and threats, for all the rumors of poison and razor blades, many Soviet young people remained undeterred. For them, chewing gum had become something more than a candy or even a commodity. It had become a symbol of the colorful Western life that existed beyond Soviet borders, a life that seemed appealing precisely because it was inaccessible. The psychology of prohibition was at work here, the same dynamic that has operated in every society that has attempted to seal itself off from outside influences. The forbidden becomes desirable, not despite, but because of its prohibition. The harder the Soviet system pushed against Western culture, the more attractive that culture became to those who chafed under Soviet restrictions. Possessing chewing gum conferred status among peers, marking one as someone with connections, someone who had access to the world beyond. Nutst. In a late 1970s interview with Pionerskaya Pravda, the official newspaper of the Young Pioneers organization, a schoolboy candidly admitted that he needed chewing gum not primarily for its taste or the act of chewing, but because he loved to be asked for some, to be the center of attention, to have something that others wanted. This small confession revealed the social dynamics that made Western goods so powerful in Soviet youth culture. They were currencies of prestige in an economy of scarcity and desire. The Soviet authorities eventually recognized that prohibition and propaganda alone could not eliminate the demand for chewing gum. The solution consistent with Soviet economic logic, was to begin domestic production, to satisfy demand through state-controlled channels rather than allowing it to be met through underground trade and contact with foreigners. But the catalyst for this decision was not simply the persistent demand for chewing gum. It was tragedy, a horrific incident that demonstrated just how powerful that demand had become and how dangerous the consequences of prohibition could be. On a day in 1975, the youth hockey teams of the Soviet Union and Canada faced each other at Sokolniki Stadium in Moscow. The Canadian team was sponsored by Wrigley's, the American chewing gum manufacturer, and some of the players and staff had brought quantities of chewing gum with them. Word spread among Soviet fans that the Canadians might distribute gum after the game, and when the match ended, a crowd of young people rushed toward the exit where the Canadian buses were parked. But the exit was blocked. Whether by deliberate decision or poor crowd management remains disputed. According to one account, stadium officials switched off the lights intentionally to prevent foreign journalists from filming Soviet teenagers clamoring for Western chewing gum, an image that would have been profoundly embarrassing for a state that claimed to provide everything its citizens needed. In the sudden darkness, with the exit blocked and hundreds of people pushing forward, a catastrophic crush developed. 21 people died in the jam, trapped and asphyxiated as the crowd pressed forward in panic. 13 of the victims were under 16 years of age, children and young teenagers who had come to watch a hockey game and perhaps hoped to obtain a piece of foreign gum. The Sokolniki Stadium disaster was a watershed moment. It could no longer be denied that the demand for chewing gum was real, powerful, and potentially deadly when combined with the restrictions and secrecy that characterized Soviet society. The state's response was characteristically Soviet in its logic. If the problem was that Soviet citizens wanted chewing gum, then the state would provide chewing gum, thereby eliminating both the demand for foreign products and the dangerous behaviors associated with obtaining them. In 1977, just 2 years after the tragedy, the first Soviet chewing gum production began in Yerevan, the capital of the Armenian Soviet Socialist Republic. Shortly thereafter, production expanded to Rotfront, one of the largest and most established confectionery companies in the Soviet Union, based in Moscow. Soviet chewing gum appeared on store shelves in packages of 5 pieces, available in strawberry, orange, mint, and coffee flavors. The introduction of Soviet chewing gum represented a significant ideological shift. A product that had been condemned as a meaningless symbol of capitalism was now being produced by socialist industry. This contradiction required no official explanation because the Soviet system had long since mastered the art of ignoring its own inconsistencies. What mattered was not ideological purity, but practical control. By producing chewing gum domestically, the state could regulate its availability, control its distribution, and, most importantly, reduce the need for Soviet citizens to obtain it through contact with foreigners or through the underground economy of Fartsovka. The state could not eliminate desire, but it could channel and manage it, transforming a symbol of Western decadence into just another Soviet consumer good. Yet Soviet chewing gum never fully replaced the desire for foreign brands. The domestic product was widely regarded as inferior in quality, losing its flavor quickly and having a texture that did not match imported gum. Until the collapse of the Soviet Union in 1991, foreign chewing gum remained a subject of speculation and underground trade, though the introduction of domestic production did reduce the intensity of demand. The forbidden fruit had become somewhat less forbidden and therefore somewhat less desirable. The excitement that had once surrounded Western chewing gum began to wane as it became clear that the Soviet state would tolerate and even produce this once condemned product. The real transformation came in the 1990s, after the Soviet Union's dissolution, when the Russian market opened to imported goods. The flood of Western products that entered Russia in this period included vast quantities of chewing gum from established international brands. Soviet-produced gum quickly disappeared from store shelves, unable to compete with the variety, quality, and marketing of Western manufacturers. For a generation of Russian children and teenagers who came of age in this chaotic transitional period, chewing gum became not a rare treasure but an everyday commodity, so common that it ceased to carry any particular prestige or meaning in itself. But the culture of scarcity and collection that had developed around chewing gum in the Soviet period found a new expression. Turbo chewing gum, a brand that became ubiquitous in Russia during the 1990s, included small paper inserts featuring pictures of cars and motorcycles. For boys growing up in a country where the streets were dominated by domestic Volgas and Jigulis, these inserts offered windows into the world of foreign automotive engineering, showcasing everything from exotic Lamborghinis and Bugattis to everyday Opels and Toyotas. The inserts became objects of collection and exchange, more valuable than the gum itself, which typically lost its flavor within 5 minutes of chewing. Or children invented games with these inserts, placing two on top of each other with edges curved slightly upward, then striking them with a palm to see if they would flip over, with the winner claiming both. There were several hundred different inserts in the Turbo series, and building a complete collection became a goal for many teenagers, driving a complex economy of trade and competition. The inserts became stakes in other games, currencies in the informal economy of schoolyard exchange. The evolution of chewing gum in Russia, from forbidden Western symbol to Soviet-produced commodity to post-Soviet collectible wrapper, traces the broader transformation of Soviet and post-Soviet society. What began as an ideological battle over cultural penetration and Western influence ended as a lesson in the futility of trying to seal off a society from global culture. The Soviet state could condemn chewing gum, could warn of its dangers, could even produce its own version in an attempt to satisfy demand while maintaining control. But it could not eliminate the fundamental human desire for novelty, for connection to a wider world, for the small pleasures and freedoms that chewing gum represented. The tragedy at Sokolniki Stadium in 1975 stands as a stark reminder of the human costs of ideological rigidity. 21 people, most of them children, died not because chewing gum was inherently dangerous, but because the system had made obtaining it dangerous, had created conditions where a simple desire for a piece of candy could lead to panic and death. The disaster forced a policy change, but it came too late for those who died in the darkness of that blocked exit, victims of a confrontation between youthful desire and state control that should never have been allowed to reach such a point. The story of chewing gum in the Soviet Union illuminates the mechanics of soft power and cultural influence during the Cold War. While historians often focus on military confrontations, nuclear arsenals, and diplomatic negotiations, the real battle for hearts and minds was often fought over much smaller things: music, fashion, and yes, chewing gum. These were the vectors through which Western culture penetrated the Iron Curtain, not through aggressive propaganda, but through simple attraction. Soviet youth did not clamor for chewing gum because they had been convinced by American advertising or CIA operations. They wanted it because it represented something different, something colorful and free, something that their own system told them they should not want, which made them want it all the more. The Soviet experience with chewing gum also reveals the limitations of state control in shaping culture and desire. The Soviet system was extraordinarily effective at controlling political expression, at suppressing dissent, at maintaining the apparatus of totalitarian power. But it proved far less effective at controlling the cultural aspirations of its own citizens, particularly the young. Every prohibition created a new desire. Every warning made the forbidden object more attractive. Every attempt to seal off Soviet society from Western influence only highlighted what lay beyond the border. The state could control production and distribution, could arrest Fartsovsky and warn of poisoned gum, but it could not control imagination or desire. In this sense, chewing gum was a small but significant defeat for the Soviet system, a demonstration that even the most powerful state cannot fully dictate the inner lives of its citizens. In the end, the question of why chewing gum was banned in the USSR reveals itself to be based on a misconception. Chewing gum was never formally banned, but it was caught in the machinery of ideological control that characterized Soviet society, condemned without being outlawed, dangerous without being illegal. This ambiguous status made it more powerful as a symbol than any formal ban could have achieved. It became a test of loyalty and a mark of rebellion, a trivial object that carried enormous symbolic weight. The story of Soviet chewing gum is ultimately a story about the gap between what a state wants its citizens to be and what they actually are, about the persistence of human desire in the face of ideological prohibition, and about the small, everyday ways that people resist systems that seek to control not just their actions, but their aspirations. The 21 people who died at Sokolniki Stadium paid the ultimate price for this confrontation, a reminder that even the smallest freedoms matter and that the costs of denying them can be tragically high.